Thank you all so much for coming out on this Friday evening in support of your local independent bookstore. It means everything to us, and it's really an exceptional experience that we get to have here at Book Passage, and it's all because of people like you. So thank you so much. This evening, Book Passage is proud to welcome Gina Nahai, author of The Luminous Heart of Jonah S., and Salar Abdoh, author of TEHRAN at Twilight. Both are exceptionally gifted writers and storytellers. And this evening, they will be in conversation with Susanne Pari, acclaimed novelist, essayist, and book critic. So please join me in a very warm welcome for Gina Nahai, Salar Abdoh, and Susanne Pari.
Good. You are good with names, Johanna. And it is Johanna. Yes. So, well, thank you all for coming out on Friday the 13th. Yeah, it's Friday the 13th. So far it's been okay, I think. We're all doing all right.
Guy with a mask, with a hockey mask, is gonna walk in.
Yeah, I didn't think of that. So tonight we're going to talk about Iran and about the wonderful novels that these two authors have written. And also I wanted to let you know that Salar has edited an anthology that's not here tonight called Tehran Noir, which is a series of stories told in the noir tradition.
I actually saw it out there.
You did see it out there. Okay,
Gina
good.
has a story.
Good. And he translated those writers from Iran who wrote in Farsi, and then you translated, except for Gina, of course. Correct? Yeah. I'm going to say just a few things about these two novels, and then I'll ask a couple of questions. You guys can talk, and then I'll open it up to this audience, which doesn't seem to be that large, but seems very smart to me. So Tehran at Twilight is a thriller. Salar is known for his wonderful thrillers about spies, espionage, convoluted tales of Iranians and Americans and other foreigners. But in every book that he writes about identity. And that's close to my heart. I'm an Iranian American who was born in this country when there were no Iranian Americans in this country, when we didn't even have a hyphen for Iranian Americans. So even though both of these books have incredible stories that will pull you in, Gina's is well, it's a murder mystery at first, dead body right away, and then the dead body disappears. So you have to keep reading on to find out who killed whom and why. But as we talked about today, it really is about, it's based on a true story of a Bernie Madoff kind of character, Iranian Jew living in Los Angeles. And there's a great deal of history in this book, and the characters are deep, and the cultural issues are very deep, especially the issue about Oberu, which I'd like to talk about. So remind me so I don't forget. That's a Farsi word, and we'll talk about it in a second. So let's first talk about the issue of writing about Iran, and especially in these times, and how you feel the audience reacts to us all writing about Iran. It's not easy to get readers or to have interest from people because there is a very narrow narrative about Iran. I think most of us will agree. So how do you feel about it, and how has your career been writing about Iran, and do you think things will change?
Salar, you go first.
Okay.
There's a mic.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I write about Iran, it's naturally...
Salar, use the mic because they're filming.
Oh,
Here. No, there's one behind him.
It'll be easier for the film.
the question, I think, is posed because of the marketplace, largely. I mean, when we write about any place, whether it's Iran or another part of the world, if one is lucky, certain things, there's a merging of certain things, current events, news, timing, and maybe, let's say, a book will become interesting to a lot of people, and you and I were talking about that today. But, you know, America being the kind of country it is, you know, there are many things happening. As I always say, the fiber of society is such that, you know, it's going in 10,000 different directions. And because of that, there's no sense of focus unless all of these factors come together. Let's take a place like Iran. If something gets translated at some point during the year, chances are you're reading the milieu that you're part of. Everybody will read those books, and everybody will talk about those books. And that's not just Iran. In almost every country that I know of, that sort of crystallization of culture exists. It's not necessarily good or bad, it's just the way it is. America being a country of many things happening in many immigrant communities and minorities and such, I see this because I teach, I'm a director of the MFA program in New York in a university. I see that even with my students, a lot of times, most of the time, everybody's sort of interested in the pocket of the background that they come from. So what that does for writers like me or others is that when you write about that, you're writing with a consciousness that you will have a limited audience for all the wrong reasons. When I write, like the sort of stuff I write, is quite different than other fiction that Iranians have written, and what Gina writes is also quite different. Because what I write is sort of called a literary thriller, so its premises and its style of writing is within a certain tradition that's not Middle Eastern at all. No one has written that way before, you know. It's actually, if it's part of any tradition, it's a couple of American writers and several British writers. But what happens then is that you write these books and the marketplace, and by marketplace I mean reviewers, book readers, you know, everybody has to figure out like where this piece of writing falls. And there is a window where all of these will be figured out, and oftentimes they're not figured out. So to make a long story short about your question, it's very difficult to write with that in the back of your head, because you're trying to write whatever it is that the story you're trying to tell, but also you're aware of the many volumes many titles that come out every year, and it makes it hard to, like you were asking me today, whether I want to continue writing fiction. I do, but more and more I'm going towards nonfiction, because all of these factors play themselves out in a different way in the nonfiction world. And I'll stop here and then we'll continue.
Yeah, I do want to talk about some of your nonfiction work that you're doing, because Salar's been in Iraq recently, and I'd like to talk a little bit about the Sunni-Shia war that's going on. But Gina, I want you to talk about what it's like to write fiction as an Iranian Jew, not just as an Iranian Jew, but as an Iranian Jew in America. Please tell us about that.
I wanted Salar to answer first because I didn't want to start with the nag. But now that he has spoken, I can nag. First, what it's like to write about Iran in America. It's okay if you realize that you're going to have a limited audience, because with few exceptions, what I've found is that the majority of American readership really isn't interested in the subject. And I'm not talking about just my book. My books, fortunately, have done well enough over the years. But I think it's more the Iranian Jewish angle that has drawn people's attention than just the subject of Iran. I was saying tonight, thank God, this is my 5th book, and this is the first book for which I haven't gone on a traditional book tour, like city to city, bookstore to bookstore. I'm saying, thank God I didn't do that for this book, because so often you'll go into a bookstore, you'll go to an event, and people just walked in and they ask you, oh, what's your book about? Oh, are you signing? What's it about? And you say, oh, it's about Iran, and that's it. And then they just drop the book and walk away because it's sort of offensive to them. And in part it's because it's not a subject, it's not like China or India, sort of something exotic and oriental and stuff. What we see of Iran, what we imagine of Iran these days is not romantic. I think in part it's that, and as in there's an antipathy toward the subject to some extent, and in part also, people reading stuff, fiction about other places, or in America, there aren't that many people reading about other places, just as there aren't that many people reading in translation. That said, I do find that the readers who actually do read the book, the non-Iranians who read the book, have always been very kind and very supportive. And they read my next one, they've read all my books, and they're always saying good things about it. So there is a core readership that is very loyal, and it's great to know them. As far as writing as an Iranian Jew in LA especially, most of my people hate me. Somebody said the other night at an event, I'm an equal opportunity offender, as in, I offend. This novel is about LA and sort of the immigrant community in LA, and how LA has changed us and how we have changed LA. And there's a scene in there where there's a real life. There's this homeless guy in Beverly Hills who's famous. He's been there for 30 some years. Everybody knows him, and he gets arrested every other day because he gets very nasty if you don't give him the money that he wants. So I've written about him, right? And then so one of the Iranians in the audience a couple of weeks ago was saying, you even offended the homeless guy. Because you write the reality, or the way I see the reality, people don't like to see that, I suppose, and so they, most of them decide that they're not going to read. Most of the Iranian Jews have decided they're not going to read my book. They have heard that it's not kind to Iranians, and therefore they won't read it. I'll just say this and then I'll stop. The best one that I've heard for this book was somebody I ran into on the street who said, I stopped reading your book. I was so offended when you killed off the guy that I said, I'm not going another word. So the book starts with, Raphael's son died. So he stopped, this woman stopped at the 3rd word in the book because they were so offended by it. So, you don't have much of a chance after that.
I think we really do have lots of trouble with our Iranian American audience, not our Iranian audience necessarily. I find that my book is far more acceptable to Iranians who are living in Iran or living in Europe than to Iranian Americans. I also have the same problem, so I'm an equal opportunity offender as well. Iranians, Muslim Iranians, American Jews, Israeli Jews, good people and bad people in both books, but the bad people offend everybody who all of their compatriots. And I have a stoning in the 3rd chapter, or in the 2nd chapter of my book, and people usually, Iranians will stop there and say, how dare you reveal that about our country? That never happens. And in fact, a professor once said that never happens, also said that it never happened that the young boys who were the minesweepers in the Iran-Iraq war wore plastic keys to heaven around their necks that were given to them so that they would believe that they would die and go to heaven. And he said, these plastic keys have never been found, and nobody ever. This was a university professor in Washington, D.C. So I think our audience really isn't always Iranian Americans. But Americans who do actually pick the books up are often surprised, because fiction, especially historical fiction or political fiction, where politics, and I don't mean political fiction, I'm not talking about The Grapes of Wrath, I'm talking about books that are about families, about relationships, about people, but you learn about the politics while you are immersed in these people's lives. I've always believed, and I used to be a journalist and became a fiction writer because I believed that that's the best way to help people understand what's really going on, because it's always more complex than you've been told it is. But the problem is getting over that barrier. And maybe now that if there's going to be a rapprochement with Iran, things will change. I'm hoping that they will. We have many more Iranian Americans. Salar is in that generation where there are many more like him. Gina's younger than me. Of course, there's hardly anybody in my generation who's an Iranian American.
I must be like 2 years younger than you. Right?
Honey, just those 2 years. I looked in the immigration census, only 20 of us born in this country.
You're kidding.
Not kidding. Yeah. Yeah. When I was in 3rd grade and people asked me, where's your dad from? And I said, Iran. They said, what's that? I had to say Persia. And then they thought flying carpets and camels, and that worked. So I think what I will do is I'll ask you about this issue of secrecy that we were talking about this afternoon, and abiru. Abiru can be defined, this is an Iranian thing that is in many other cultures, but it seems to be extremely important in our culture, and it's something that's very prominent in your novel. And it's the way we keep things to ourselves, and it's also about pride. So Gina, if you could talk about abiru and what it is, and maybe it will help people understand Iranian culture better.
But abiru is a combination of having a good public profile, but also a good name, as in to be known for being a good person, for having done good things in your life. So it's not it's celebrities in this country have very high public profiles, but they have no abiru, especially if you're people like Paris Hilton. She has no abiru whatsoever. To have abiru, you have to be from an old traditional family, or your grandparents have to have done good things for the community, and you have to have abided by all the rules, and also you have to have had no flaws. There is a love affair in Iran with perfection that I think perhaps is rare in the world. As in, there's this idea that we have to be perfect, we have to be beautiful, we have to act right, we have to talk properly. Language is important, manners are important, and I know it's sort of counterintuitive with what you see nowadays going on, but I'm talking about among people with abiru, all this stuff is very important, which means that a lot of flaws have to be kept secret. So, and the thing with abiru is, first of all, it's passed down. You inherit it, and then your children inherit it. So if your parents had lost their abiru, then the children won't have inherited an abiru to inherit. Which means that your actions will affect your children and your grandchildren, and that's something to be very cognizant of. To a great extent, this, especially within the Jewish community, because it was a small community in Iran, abiru was what kept social relations in a certain level of civility, let's say. It meant that you have to keep a lot, well, you thought you're keeping a lot of secrets. You know, there are no secrets in a small community. So everybody knew your secret and you knew everybody else's secret, but you spend 70% of your energy trying to guard what you think is a secret from everybody else. So there is, and that's because you're trying to protect your Aberu. What happened when we came to the United States is that all of a sudden, Aberu was not so important anymore. You know, it's not the same rules don't apply here. People don't have long memories here. You're not in a, literally, you're not living in a contained space with a lot of people who know you. You know, America's the land of reinvention and self-reinvention. And so this idea of, well, I'm gonna not touch certain things or not act in a certain way because of my Aberu, my children, became rather meaningless. Which enabled a lot of people to do stuff that probably wouldn't have happened in Iran. And you know, we were there for 3,000 years, and nothing on this scale of what I write about in the book, nothing on this scale happened for 3,000 years until we came to America. So I'll stop here, and Salar, you wanna?
I want to ask Salar along the same lines. You.
I have no Aberu. I lost it a long time ago.
Yeah. Salar
I
is,
gave it back.
so Gina and I still have that from our parents, and Salar is sort of like a little bit younger, and it's like an entire generation of newly invented.
Yeah, but he comes from a legendary family, though.
Yeah, but he doesn't care.
Yeah, well.
See, there's a big difference. Yeah. He comes from a legendary family, but he doesn't hardly ever talk about it.
You should talk about it.
Anyway, I don't want you to talk about your legendary family. I want you to talk about your legendary characters in here. So there's two guys who are the main characters. There are some very interesting non-main characters, including you reminded me of him today, the Marine who. The former Marine who becomes a professor at the university where one of the characters is, and his take on how America is viewing the war and etc. It's two characters. They come to the United States after the Revolution. They go to school here. They grow up here. One of them stays on, becomes a university professor in New York. The other one goes back to Iran and becomes very anti-American. And it is about them coming together again. I'd like you to talk a little bit about these characters and how they came to you and what you were trying to explore with them.
Okay, these two guys, they're a compilation, both of them, of many people or several people I have known and worked with over the years in the Middle East.
Just I want to interrupt you 1 second and tell the audience. Of the three of us, Salar is the only one who can freely go back and forth to Iran, to the Middle East, and here. So he has a very, very different and more up-to-date view of what's going on over there than we do.
Okay. Yeah, so it's basically, and also a lot of autobiographical stuff as well in these two men and other characters that are in the book. And I just wanted to explore the whole notion of, I explored it to a certain extent in my earlier novels when I was going to school in Berkeley here, and I was in the Middle Eastern Studies department, and I started to see a pattern. I'm not going to get into what I started to see, but I thought the Islamic world, and particularly the Middle East, is moving in a certain direction where certain things are going to happen. And they did, but it took a while. It took another decade for it to start. And I went back to Iran to live for a few years after college. And then I came back, and then I started going back a lot, and more all the time. And I go a couple of times a year now. And in those books, for instance, in my first book, and this goes back to your first question about audiences, when I'd written my first book, The Poet Game, I had actually, those two books before this book, they were much more thriller. This is more literary than a thriller, but it uses the vehicle of the thriller to tell its story. But in the first book, The Poet Game, I had written about, the premise of the book was about these people coming from the Middle East here to blow up certain structures, particularly in New York, in order to draw the United States into a prolonged war into the Middle
You wrote
East.
that
This
before
was
the-
before 9/11.
That was, it came out about a year and a half before 9/11. So what's interesting about that, when I talked earlier about the merging of stuff, I remember, for instance, I was in a bookstore in Sag Harbor, Long Island, beautiful place, when the book first came out, and I was there with an audience of 2, and I think they were just happening by. And then after 9/11, after all the things that happened, and suddenly everybody thought I had some special antenna to, I was invited to that same bookstore, and you had to keep people out. Like, everybody came to see, and then I was running into journalists in Europe and here and there, and they're saying, these guys in think tanks in Washington, they're sitting there reading your book to try to, so I had treated this idea because I thought it was serious, and I thought I know where we were heading, and I was looking at it on a several decades long basis, and then I went back to it on a different angle in the second book. In the third book, I really wanted to tap into the psychological dimension of men who perhaps they've had the similar experiences. I have known men such as myself who have, came here at a certain age, they went to school here, and suddenly there was a switch, and they just became somebody else, and they went back and they did certain things. And so as I became more and more involved in the Middle East for a variety of reasons, not all of which have to do with book writing, I saw a lot of things. I saw people doing different things. I got involved with correspondents, war reporters, and when you're in that world, you end up seeing all kinds of different people, journalists, and I wanted to explore that on a variety of sub-themes. The main theme of the book is about this friendship of 2 men who grew up here, not far from here where we're sitting today, and one of them becomes, like me, a university professor, and the other one becomes an anti-American. And then in the book, these 2 guys, the guy who goes back and becomes anti-American, he needs the help of the guy who stays, and then that kickstarts the book. But at the same time, there are all these sub-themes that go on. For instance, the former Marine captain. I didn't want this book to be just about Iran. I've known a few guys in the military, whether you were pro-war or anti-war, that's one issue. But, a lot of these guys who served their country here, they meant well, and they went there with the best of intentions, and sometimes, you come back. We were talking today about, I don't know if you guys know much about what happened in Iraq, but the 2 battles of Fallujah were 2 of the most horrendous battles that, the Marines, the American Marines, really, they did what they had to do. And as soon as America got out, within no time at all, it was occupied again by the extremist Sunni factions. So I wanted to touch about all that. I wanted to talk about how it feels to have been that Marine captain, and how it feels to be in the sky who's a university professor, and he lives a dual life like I do, going back and forth, and how it feels to be that guy who, being what does being a rabid anti-American mean? It means different things. It can mean somebody who just sits home and screams at America, the great Satan, on the television, or somebody who does something about it, goes to Iraq or Afghanistan. So I wanted to put all of these guys together and really write about the limits of friendship and loyalty and betrayal and all of these things. And I'll stop here.
Gina, talk at the tail end of what Farad is talking about and thinking about the issue of Israel and Iran and the issues that a lot of Jews are having in America over what's happening between Israel and Iran. And I have my own opinions, but you are going to have a completely different view of everything, being an Iranian Jew. And can you tell us a little bit about how the Jews in LA feel about what's going on and about Iran and Israel and this what Netanyahu has been saying about the threats?
I think most of us feel betrayed by the country, because Iranian Jews were the original Jews, or the Jews in that area in Iran. And
You mean betrayed by Israel? Or betrayed?
No, betrayed by the revolution.
By the revolution.
Because the biggest victims of the Iranian revolution were Muslims. There's no question about that. But for us, we've been there for 3,000 years, and the fact that we left, and for a long time there was a sense that going back was not a good idea, that it was not safe, that you never knew who is or isn't going to be persecuted. Officially being Jewish is completely acceptable, but being a Zionist is not. And the line between whether, what is a Zionist and what's just being Jewish for a while was rather blurred. So for a lot of us, there's a sense of the love of the country and the absolute love of the culture and its history and its the food, the language, and all of that. And yet the place, Iran itself, does not feel like a home anymore. So it's a very strange place to be. In terms of how people feel about this relationship between Iran and Israel, we still caught in that in the time when Iran and Israel were great friends. For us, again, this animosity, I don't know what people think of Netanyahu. I think that Netanyahu is like Bush. Seriously. It's like I think the worldwide Jewish community, including Israel, are like divided almost, in the middle. Some people love him and some people hate him. In the long run, just like Bush, I think that he's bad for the country. Forget what is bad for other countries, but for himself, the country that he thinks he is helping, just like Bush was, I think in the long run, he's harming that country. So I don't know what they think about that, but for us, Iran and Israel were really so close and things were so good for so long while my generation grew up, for my parents' generation, that seeing this division and this animosity is still something unreal. The Iranian soccer team will have a game against the US, and everybody in their homes is watching the Iranian soccer team, all the Jews, and waving the flag, and they're all supporting the Iranian soccer team. And then next thing you know, you're thinking, oh, well, and now Iran is talking about bombing Israel or erasing Israel. It's a very strange place to be.
Yeah. So I would love to open up for some questions. I always like to know what the audience is interested in, because it's not always the same thing that I'm interested in. So if you have any questions, I'd love to take them. Yes?
You speak a little bit about the Shiite Sunni
Divide.
split, where it's going, what it means.
Right. This, the question is about the Sunni Shiite split, or the differences and where it's going.
Not good.
Is-
I don't feel myself to be an expert in all of these. I can just speak from my own experiences, being in the region and not just in Iran. You know, if you read newspaper accounts of think tank people or journalists who come and go out of these places, they would say things like, you know, Arabs and Persians, you know, they don't like each other, or, you know, they fought an 8-year war. There's a definite chasm between them, so we don't have to worry about, you know, Iran controlling the Shiite population in Iraq. To begin with, I think those kinds of analyses are incorrect. Even their very premise is incorrect because it has no nuance to me. But what has happened, and I'm not going to get into the notion of who started all this and why it started and what America's role was, what Saudi Arabia's role was, or what Qatar's role was, or Iran. But now we're in a situation, and this is kind of the essay that I sent you and I read the other day. You know, things have changed, and they have changed drastically in the Middle East because of this war. And there really has, a Shiite-Sunni divide has come into being.
No, what?
Thanks.
Susanne decided.
Yeah, I decided you needed some.
Sorry, I
Hydration.
got this cold and it hasn't gone away. Anyway, so and Iran is, the Shiite power in the Middle East, in the world, and it has a considerable Sunni population, but its identity is a Shiite identity, and that has many problems. But if you travel in Iraq, and you really feel that divide where it's become, and it may change because things change fast. Wars impose situations on people, and then when those situations no longer exist, things change. But let's say if you're in Iraq or Syria today, and there's this civil war going on, when I was in Iraq last, this talk on the street was, the Shiite talk was that they just want the commander of the Quds Brigade, Haj Qasem, we call him Haj Qasem Soleimani, to just come and save the situation. And he's a hero, make no mistake about it. He's a hero in Iraq with the Shiites. He's a hero even with, it's interesting how these things happen. He's a hero in Iran with people who have nothing to do, who've never prayed one day in their lives. So that split is very real, and on the Sunni side also, because too many people have died. I was telling our friends that with some journalists today, and these two ladies were there. We made a documentary. My friend Majid did of a certain massacre of 1,700 Air Force cadets in Camp Speicher in Iraq. And when these things happen, and the divide that develops, it's very, very hard to sort of say, we're all Muslims, we're all this, we're all that. It might happen at some point, but right now, there's things happening in Yemen, with the Shiite population. There's Syria, there's Iraq, there's definitely unrest under the surface now in Bahrain, in Saudi Arabia itself. And there's unrest in Iran, in Sistan, Baluchistan, and in some other parts with the Sunni populations, and also in Afghanistan, and also in Pakistan. And you just take it. I don't feel good about the situation at all, and I think it's pretty reductive and simplistic to think, just because they're Arab, they're Persian, it's going to be one way. Things happen in a time of absolute crisis that changes loyalties. But it can change again. But I don't see it happening anytime now.
I think that this Sunni Shia war, and I've been calling it that or thinking of it as that for many years now, Americans in the West are just, in general, have been unaware of it until recently. But that really is such a firm basis for a lot of what's going on there now. It's not necessarily about the West and the East. It's really on the ground, would you agree, about the Sunni and the Shia?
I'm sorry, my mind went all of a sudden. What's the question?
Bring it back. No, it's okay. It doesn't matter because I want to make sure that other people have their questions. Yes, Nasser.
Don't you think this would have eventually happened anyway? I mean, wasn't there a lid that was placed on this for?
No, I don't think so at all. It wasn't inevitable.
1960s, Saddam Hussein wrote a best-selling book.
Best-selling book, you mean, because he
99.9%
forced
everybody.
everybody.
Yes, and the title was The Three Mistakes of God. It was Persians, Jews, and Flies.
Is that true?
Yes.
Is that
absolutely.
true? Persians, Jews, and flies, the three mistakes of God.
And the word Persian was code for the Shia.
Well, yeah.
So, and as a member of a minority, it was suppressing the majority at the time, for a long time. It just seems to me it was going to boil over at some point.
But you don't think so?
I don't think any of this was inevitable, but I think what Saddam Hussein did was to create a society that lived on absolute horror, especially for the Shiites. I mean, this is what's interesting, and it's kind of boils my blood sometimes. God bless the Americans, but they'll come to a place and they'll do what they have to do, and then they leave and
You can
say,
say we'll do.
hmm?
We'll do what we have to do.
Yeah, and then they say, well, you have to create a working government with Shiite, Sunni, and Christian, and whatever. These things, people are not robots, The guy who has had his family tortured under Saddam or under Assad or whoever, it's not, one can't just switch, in 1 second and say, I'm in Iran, I have an essay about it, I'm in Iran, and I'm driving in the Azerbaijan province with my friend, my brother calls me and said, the sanctions came into a new phase, and immediately, like, the little money I have over there that I want to bring here and maybe put a down payment on a house with, becomes a fraction of what it is, right? And then immediately I'm raging against the US, against this, against that, against sanctions, and that's just like money. It's not even about human beings. Imagine these people, they for decades, I'm not talking about who's right or wrong, but it's hard to make that switch. It's hard to
So that's what he's saying, that the animosity
Yeah.
goes
Well,
way
no,
back,
yeah.
and that
So essentially, what I'm saying is, this is what we saw as a microcosm in Lebanon is just spreading. I mean, there is a new equilibrium in Lebanon now. They do coexist.
Mhm.
They did come to some understanding. They did divide the government into different. Everybody has their stake in there, and that's probably
Well, but
something.
they have a war every few years. There's bombing.
Suzanne, don't forget. I mean, we had no reformation in the Middle East. Europe has had tens of millions of people die in just the last 100 years. Let's not forget these facts. I mean, it took a long time for Europe to settle down and essentially agree on borders that are still not settled. Just look at Ukraine today. So it's just, to me, it seems okay. Somebody may come and sort of catalyze it, accelerate it, like with an American invasion and so forth. But I mean, just the suppression of the Sunnis in Syria by the Alawis and so forth over time. It builds, as you're saying, it builds this groundswell of resentment that is eventually going to just blow up at some point. So, that's my 10 cents worth.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I was hoping to hear about the characters of the story.
Oh, I'm happy to.
Because
I'm so
I
glad
haven't
that
read
that's
the
what
books,
I
and I
opened.
was hoping to hear about the.
Okay, that's that's what I like to talk
Yeah.
about, but you never know these days because everything is political, and so let's talk about the characters.
Or you want us to talk about it?
Please,
She
I
wants
mean,
to
the
know.
environment of your story, all I heard was the other room.
Oh, yeah.
But it
okay.
did more than that. I'm sure it did a lot more than that.
Yeah, it's the story. The plot revolves around this guy who, this man who ended up basically running this massive Ponzi scheme in LA among the wealthy Iranian Jews, mostly Iranian but also American Jews in Los Angeles. And in the book, the story is that he was the illegitimate son of a man in Iran who belonged to a very wealthy family, was not recognized as part of the family because they felt that he was legitimate, so he didn't have the family's name, and that his mother, being the man's wife, had been wrong. Now, I grew up seeing these people. I mean, the character, the woman in the book. The widow is somebody who used to come to our house all the time. I knew the son like that, but now they're invented in the book. But so he carries this rage with him. In Iran, having a name was very important. It wasn't something that you just gave away. So you were protective of the family's name, and so he was denied this, and he was denied the family inheritance, and he comes to LA and he makes his own fortune, and then he really sets up this community, gets them to trust him and to give him his money, very much like Bernie Madoff did with the wealthier community in this country. And in the case of our real Madoff in LA, the person that the book is inspired by, but it's not about him and it's not about his family, and I must say that and stress that very, very vehemently. But in the case of the real guy, the difference between him, yes, the difference between him and Madoff was that he got to keep all the money. What he did was he just passed it to his wife and his kids and his brothers and his sisters, and the money's there, and they actually flaunt it very flagrantly all over the place. Madoff at least was forced to give the money back. In the case of Madoff, there was a trustee that gave some money back to some people. In the case of this guy in LA, the trustee, every dime that the trustee collected from the estate, the trustee also billed and received from the bankruptcy proceedings. So there was an American trustee who got extremely wealthy to the tune of $100 million, literally. And so all of that takes place in the book as well. And so that's the plot, but really the story is very much about LA and about immigration and about how America changes, the way America changes people, for the better and for the worse.
But you also, I have to tell you, because you're going to read the book, I hope, Gina is known for her penchant for magic realism. So there definitely is some of that in this book, especially when in the scenes where it's pre-revolution Iran, and the father of this child is, well, the uncle of this child is, they're living in this very wealthy big compound, but there's just so much eeriness to to that time. There's a woman called the Black Witch, or is it the Black Bitch?
Well, the Black Bitch of Boucher, yeah.
The Black Bitch of Boucher, this woman who is ugly and awful, and she comes and she manages to sort of hook the eldest son in her and make him marry her, and he's this weak person who sleepwalks through Tehran in the middle of the night and gathers moths, and he has this luminous body. It's really, really, I mean, Gina, you really did a good job, especially with the mudslide and the water. I'm telling you, I mean, it's really an amazing story. And then we're in LA, and there's all this infighting in the community, and there's this one woman who writes a blog about how all the Iranian Jews are awful and how they're acting so poorly.
She doesn't
Well,
say they're
she's
awful.
wonderful.
They all, you know, they all hate her because
Because she
because
reveals
they hate me.
because she reveals the secrets of the community, and they want her to be quiet. So if you're looking for characters, both of these books, and because we have time constraint to a certain extent, I want to ask Salar to talk about the mother-son issue in his book, because that sort of made me cry whenever I read about it, because I have a son, and it's just beautiful. So tell us about this character.
Okay. There are two mothers in this book that they just sort of took over in a way as I was writing this book. And I had never managed to my taste, write successfully about women until now. I'd always struggled with that. And in this novel, actually, when I wrote it in the first draft, my agent, God bless her, being a woman, she gave me a few pointers that made me go back to the novel, and it wasn't like I decided I'm going to include women. But you know, as they entered the novel, they took over to a certain extent. One of them is about this happens in a place like Iran a lot of times, or in a place that's gone through a revolution, and then people start coming back in Iran to get like things that they lost back, whether it's usually real estate, and then there's these fights between families and things like that. So the guy who goes back and becomes the anti-American, he does certain things to his mother, who comes from a very well-off family, very cultured family, and then he kind of regrets it. But it's too late for him to make amends, so he wants to make amends through his friend, who is the college professor. And then the college professor himself has issues because he is under the impression that his mother just left him decades ago and moved to Australia, not knowing that that's the story his father gave him. But in fact, she's been living in Tehran all these years. And what happened was that this woman, like a lot of people in those days, she was a communist. You know, a lot of the intellectuals in pre-revolutionary Iran and through the revolution, you know, they came from the left, from the various left-wing factions. And she was under the surveillance and had to do some things that she paid for later on. But it's a coming together of this Reza Malik, who is the main hero of the novel, and discovering his mother and discovering what a special person she is and how she has suffered through all these years in Tehran. And their relationship kind of becomes the core relationship and takes over the novel in a way, so that it kind of makes the relationship between the two friends far more faint than the
I agree.
relationship.
For me, I thought it was because I'm a woman and I have a son, but for me it was really the key relationship in the book.
Yeah, it became for me too. And then there's a sub-theme, and I'll say there's some stuff because we've been talking about Jewish themes here. she has a neighbor who was one of these people, and this goes back to another book I've been working on for a few years. I picked up this stuff thing. She has a neighbor who's Jewish from Eastern Europe, but when they escaped and came to Iran, she hid her Jewish identity, and she remained all of these years. So after she dies, the main hero, Reza Malik, and his mom, the book, I'm not going to give it away, but they kind of, towards the end of the book, they were in Poland and they go visit where this neighbor was first born. And yeah, I'll stop here.
It's really interesting, very interesting.
And there are people like that. I mean, these things happen. These Jewish people from Eastern Europe did come through Iran, and some of them did stay. And so this goes back to my research about another part of modern Iranian history that has to do with Jews, Persian Jewish history, and also Iran's place in modern Jewish history throughout the 20th century. Yeah.
I have a question for Salar. Salar, when you were in Iran, did you meet with the Jewish community? Did you actually have encounters with the Jewish community?
Actually, yes, many.
Yeah, I just recently, I mean, I've seen documentaries over and over, but I just recently saw a documentary about Jewish living in Iran, and they were interviewed, and it seems like there's a great number of Jewish people still living in Iran.
Not anymore.
There's about 5,000 in the whole country.
Oh.
And they're there because they want to be.
Right.
As in, it's not like they're imprisoned or they're afraid to leave. And they feel safe, and that's their home, and that's where they want to belong. What I was saying about Jews feeling betrayed by the country, I'm talking about the regime. This idea that the Iranian government talks about Israel as some sort of stain upon the world, and then it's going to get cleared off, or it has to be turned into the sea, or that kind of animosity that didn't exist under the Shah, and that is so anti-Iranian Jewish, because for us, Israel is a Jewish state and Iran is our home, but we are also Jewish. So when they talk about Jews this, Jews that, all the insults that they hurl at Jews, thinking that, well, this is directed at Israel, but they say Jews, they don't say Israelis, they say Jews, 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 and that is something hurtful. It would be like a Shia suddenly in Iran, and the government of Iran turning Sunni, and all of a sudden the Shias are supposed to be najis and awful and this and that, and you feel like this is my country, and all of a sudden the government is calling me stuff. You see what I'm saying? So it's not about the people of Iran, it's about the government.
I think for those of us who write novels about Iran, and also about people who are, and we write political novels also, for us, I don't know if this is the case for you, but for me, the most important thing was to impart this understanding that the government is a completely different animal from the people. And that's not always something that Americans seem to grasp or want to grasp. Maybe more so now than they used to, but when I first wrote The Fortune Catcher, and it came out in '97, you wrote Cry of the Peacock in '92, Iran was the government, and Iranians were reflecting in Americans' minds, in Westerners' minds, what the government was saying. And it's just not the case. As an Iranian, I'm sure you know that. It's just not the case.
Yeah, but I think, when it comes to Israel, it's a different issue. Just like in this country, the Jews worldwide and the Jews in Israel support one government versus another, right? But so how you feel about the actions of a government, just like any other country, how you feel about the actions of the government is something separate from how you feel about the country itself, right? So for me, I believe completely that Israel should exist. And it should exist because of the history of Jews from the inception, from the very beginning until now, and all the persecution, and that the Jewish state should exist. Now, personally, should it have been created the way it was, with the Palestinians being driven off and all of that? No. Should the Gaza and the West Bank be in the state that they are? No. But at the end of the day, when the government of Iran, when Iranian mobs walk through the street and call death to Israel, right, or that will annihilate Israel, that to me is offensive.
I agree.
Right? I don't support one government, I may support another government, but that's beside the point, right? Now, in LA, when Susanne was asking, and I sense that you probably have the same feeling, people, not just in LA maybe, but in LA is my experience, people really transition between Jewish and Israeli whenever they want. So that a lot of anti-Israel stuff is just the disguise for anti-Semitism.
Well,
And then a lot of it,
it's an American phenomenon.
well, yeah, and a lot of it also is anti-Israel stuff, right? But I have no problem, and most Jews have no problem with anybody saying that Netanyahu is an asshole, whatever, right? Absolutely not. I don't think he should have come and made this speech. I think it was offensive and awful, right? But I do have a problem when people either attack the existence of the state, or when they call Israelis Jews and then say Jews did this and the other, and that's what they do in Iran. That's what the government does. That's what the mullahs do. I mean, anytime you want, you can go online and pull up, and there are all these speeches that the mullahs are constantly giving about how Jews have tails, and I've seen that. How Jews have tails, right? And all the other crap. And so when you see that, and you are an Iranian, it's pretty awful.
I think with timing,
We're
we're pretty close. If you want
Pretty
to
close.
finish up and then.
okay, Sana.
I just wanna, because I have been involved, I mean, I wear many different hats, but one of the things I've done through these years is this the Jewish history vis-a-vis Iran. And I was just telling her, we were having breakfast in Los Angeles a few days ago, and I was telling her about being in Uzbekistan. I was following the trail of these Jewish kids who came from Eastern Europe and ended up in Tehran and were saved. And they had to go through Uzbekistan. And they were in these two cities, Bukhara and Samarkand, which are the cradles of Persian civilization also. And I was there with my colleague, who is from Israel, following the trail of her father and her aunt, who were two of these kids who were saved and went to mandatory Palestine at that time. And I was telling Gina that I was in the synagogue in the city of Bukhara, and the rabbi was speaking to me the Persian of 1,000 years ago, and I was translating that to my Israeli colleague.
Wow.
And it was the most amazing moment. It was one of several amazing moments of my life in that trip. And I understand what she's saying, because I was in Bukhara and I was thinking, these were cradles of Persian civilization, and that is ending. In 2 more generations, there won't be any Persian speakers in these 2 cities, because Stalin decided on purpose to, cut them off from the Tajikistan. Imagine if you're a Jew in these cities, the Bukharan Jews, ever since the release of the Second Reich, they've been there for 3,000 years, right? And the rabbi says to me, there's 400 of us left. And that's just heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking whether you're a Persian and you think in a couple of generations, there won't be any more Persian speakers in these two cities that gave so much to Persian civilization. It's heartbreaking to me. I'm not a Jew in any, there's nothing Jewish about me, but I love I love history, I love the continuity in history, and when I think that in another generation there will not be any Bukharan Jews in Bukhara and Samarkand, that breaks my heart, because it breaks my heart when ISIS comes into the city of Mosul and destroys these 3,000-year-old artifacts that are part of human civilization. And I think wherever we fall on the side of politics, I can understand the pain of this woman, because I felt it another way in those two cities of Bukhara and Samarkand.
Let me just say one thing real quick. In LA, a couple of weeks ago, I was moderating a panel. There was a Yazidi and a Copt. And they had come to LA to get support, financial support, political support, and so on for the Yazidis and the Copts against ISIS in the Middle East. The Yazidi guy, the Copts had a larger population. I don't know, you guys know about Yazidis, right? All right, so they've been around from 5,000 years ago also, and mostly in Iraq, but also in Syria and so on. And what he was saying was that this current generation of Yazidis that's really getting wiped out by ISIS, right? After this, there won't be any Yazidis left. And he said the reason for that is that we haven't been allowed to defend ourselves, because the government of Iraq, the government of Syria, historically, whatever government they were under, they were a minority, and they weren't allowed to arm themselves and defend themselves. And so now the daughters are getting taken into slavery, and the wives are getting raped, and the entire population of Yazidis may well be completely wiped out in the next few years, only because they weren't allowed to have a standing army to defend themselves. And so that's why, to Jews, Israel is an important place. You see, because it's the place that is allowed to arm itself and defend other Jews.
Okay. I think we have to wrap it up. Johanna is signaling me. Thank you so much for coming and for your great questions. I hope you buy these books. They will take you away to another place, I promise, and a beautiful escape, and you'll learn something painlessly. And I think these authors will be signing, so please feel free to purchase and ask them to sign. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Susanne.